you can access our models. The models are in here also. We have 2 models that we created specifically for this workshop. They're both around reputation, and you can download them, and you can run them if you have Stella. They both require Stella to run at this point. But when you download them, you'll need to put them in a separate folder, and then all the materials in one folder, and because they're zip files, and then run them from there. So you can run them.
We're going to be saying more about this, but Pascal and I have done this workshop twice before. We didn't do it last year, and so a lot of the organization of the workshop has stayed the same. But one thing that we felt would be useful would be to kind of have, maybe a consistent reference to 1 or 2 kind of thematic models. These are demonstration models, and Pascal's done a lot, actually. I've supported, but to kind of put these together, they're chock full of all kinds of examples of things that we're going to be talking about in the workshop. But there are other models, too, that we had put together. So that website that Pascal shows you is really kind of a repository of prior workshops that we've done. There's an annotated bibliography of papers, some published and peer-reviewed, some from the society that we think are interesting, and it's a place to kind of like poke around or explore if you are looking for more information about these topics and or examples of things that we're talking about today.
We also have a paper we wrote with Ralph Levine. Ralph has been a mentor to both of us in this field, so I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Ralph doing this type of workshop. And we wrote a paper with him on co-flows, which is in there also, which we'll talk about. We'll give examples from that in this workshop.
Yeah, and actually I should say I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Ralph either, because Ralph was my major mentor and my major professor at Michigan State University, where I did my doctoral work in ecological community psychology. And Ralph he's still a pioneer, but he was really an early pioneer of thinking about ways of using system dynamics modeling in community research as a tool for participatory research, and just as a way of kind of exploring psychological theory and models, social theory and models, behavior. So, and Ralph is with us today. I'm so happy about that.
Well, this pioneer still is having problems with the link to the models.
Go into the website where you join the conference, and there's something that says additional materials. Click that, then click the mind map. But I'm going to put the mind map link in the chat box right now, so you can click on the mind map link. Okay.
Yeah,
I did click on it, and I'm not sure what nothing seems to be happening.
Try again. We're going to have to move on though.
Okay.
Okay. So let me give a brief overview of this mind map, because you can each look at it yourselves, and you can. I have filters in it so that it's strange to say this, but there's things we're not going to talk about unless asked today, but those are in the mind map, and so we have a preventives map. So here are things that we may not talk about. The answers to some things, some more detailed notes when we're going to ask some questions, some other additional topics, some stuff about some other examples. So I'm going to fade those out so that we'll talk about them if we need to. There are additional materials. We decided to focus mostly on reputation models this time. Last time we had models from all different places, and because we were researching the field. Now we took what we learned and applied it to one topic, reputation. Okay. So when you go into there's a README file up here. It tells you how to navigate the map. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change my viewing options. So we're going to go into presentation mode. And this is in the map too. The instructions are in the map for doing this. And I'm going to go into presentation mode, and then we'll start the presentation. Okay.
I would say that for those of you participating, you really just watching the screen, the shared screen, is probably sufficient for right now. If you have the opportunity to have other windows open, then having the mind map open things that might.
And mute yourself unless you're talking.
Okay, Pascal.
Okay, so let's see. So what we want to do, like I oscillate from being a mathematical physicist to being a psychologist. It's from psychology to mathematical physics, so I do life coaching. And David is a community psychologist. So we have different layers of experience. So we want to share what our experience and our research insights that we've had over the years that we've done this, gone over this material and discussed it. And one point is that we are always learning. It's an evolving process. So your questions can help us learn more. You know, I would never say I'm an expert. I would say I'm a person who always needs to keep learning and getting new information and getting new insights. So that's the theme. So we have about 28 people. So if you have a question, just jump in and ask the question at any point. I thought if we've had more, we'd put them in the chat box. But you can also put it in the chat box, and Braveheart and David will be looking at the chat box.
That's right.
Yeah. So I gave you the map overview already, and let's jump into the introduction. So we'd like people to become familiar with how to transform psychological or sociological variables or constructs into model variables. And again, I mentioned we don't need to cover everything. This material, by the way, will be up in this website, you know, for as long as I have the website. So there's no need to worry about it ending after we talk about it. And we may even update it over time. So the questions for this workshop is, how do you translate these concepts into variables? And some other questions might be, how would you measure or quantify them? Are they like physical variables? When do I need to include them in a model? Do I need to include them at all? I've seen models about contagion this week, which could have had psychological variables in them, but didn't. And we discussed that during that session. Okay, can they be stocks? And there are other questions you might have. Basically, we're looking and examining this topic. Okay. So let's get this straight here.
Yeah.
So what do these things have in common? What do these variables have in common? They're actually constructs. Satisfaction. We gave a talk at the Fannie Mae in the U.S., and their interest was in home purchase sentiment. What's sentiment of people in buying homes? In the U.S. now, it's high because it could be high. We have to investigate that because the interest rates are low. But yet people might be hesitant about going out to buy homes. So there's that concept of home purchase. So what they have in common is that they're all these constructs, sociological and psychological constructs. So we've got a lot of comments, and you can read this in the field. You may have heard this, that soft variable and user term variables can't be used, well, because they're intangible and they can't be measured. How do you measure anger? They would say. Mm-hmm. They're non-material. You know, it's not like the mass of an electron. We can't use non-material things in stock and flow diagrams and stock and flow structures. It's bad, and even this, we'll have one, but it's bad practice to have more than one in a model. My Lord. And yet there are people in the field who say, well, often the greatest benefit of a modeling project is to help the client see the importance of these soft variables and to measure and account for soft variables and concepts previously ignored. And Kim Warren, in his book on strategic management dynamics, it's widely accepted that intangible or soft factors have a substantial impact on an organization's performance. A damaged reputation can destroy a business. Strong staff motivation can drive a powerful growth. This is probably the key for our thinking that maybe reputation would be a good topic to include in this workshop. And here you can jump in. Here is a model I pulled from Warren's book. Which variable is psychological, sociological, or soft?
Yeah.
Just jump in and say it. You know, it's good.
Yeah. What we have here is a very simple model, 3 stocks. Which of them would you kind of classify as psychological or sociological?
Reputation.
And how do you
reputation? Yes,
actually,
that's one.
How do you use those terms, soft and intangible? What would you point to that way? What is a hard variable in the model? Yes, absolutely.
So tell me if you're reading the chat. Let me know what it is. I'm looking at the chat. You can put it in the chat too.
In the chat, what I'm seeing is like people, right? Reputation, annoyance are definitely examples of soft variables. What about service quality? That's being computed.
I think we can calculate service quality, can't we?
You can calculate, but is it a soft variable?
I think it's a soft variable because it your perceptions. Each person can have a different perception.
Yes, so it is a soft variable. How we implement them in models is going to be different. We'll discuss that. But yes, it is a soft variable. Any other soft variables? We got reputation. We got client annoyance, service quality. Any other ones in this?
Pressure on staff.
Yes, definitely, Ralph. Pressure on staff.
You know, but then to the point about things like pressure on staff and service quality, I mean, there, I guess, is a way of thinking about these as maybe like there could be objective measures of these things that, you know, might kind of move it into a more rigorously assessed variable, and we can talk about that.
So does anyone find any issues with this model as it stands now?
What do you mean by issues, Pascal?
I mean, well, client annoyance could go to 1 million. Do I want client annoyance to go to 1 million? I mean, I don't see any way of unbounding it. I don't see anything in this model that's going to make it limited. Or reputation. There's no structure in the model that could make reputation blow up to 1 trillion.
I've thought about this for a while. You guys probably know the answer, but couldn't you have the participants that are using the models establish a scale, and from like 0 to 10 or 0 to 100 that defines what those M parameters are?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Would that solve this problem?
That'll solve that problem. So and then we can do that. And then, but that says that actually is the scale for the problem. But then your model has to maintain that scale.
If everybody agrees what defines, if you define pressure on staff and everybody defines what is a 0 and what is a 10, and they're all in agreement about it for the use of that particular.
No, yeah, I agree completely with you. They all agree on what the meaning of the reputation is from 0 to 10 or whatever. However, the model itself, the stock and flow model that you're going to run and simulate, needs to make sure that it stays in that range.
Right. So that's more of a kind of technical point, but I think what Suzanne is saying is actually a really, really important point of what we want to kind of communicate in this workshop, that it is about understanding how to kind of represent these ideas in a model in a way that resonates with a particular audience or the people that you're working with. So it is a negotiated process of coming up with a way of scaling certain variables or representing them maybe on a particular scale, and making sure that that is useful and meaningful. And useful and meaningful not only in the context of the variable itself, that one in the model, but there probably are other variables in the model that, if you start to look at the dynamics, you want to be able to kind of like compare and contrast. So thinking about ways of being consistent and everything. So now I'm really jumping ahead. But
so we're going to go. We're going to jump ahead.
You're right on track, Suzanne.
Okay.
Go ahead, Pascal.
And that was the purpose of that. So, what we're looking at is we have constructs which are reputation or anger or something, and they're often theoretical. They're qualitative, and we want to move from the construct to have some way of measuring it, like Suzanne said, have an agreement about it, and then have a way of not only quantifying it from a value, but saying what it means to be that value, and then step further, have it measurable. Then we can actually add it as a variable. For example, I created part of the slide at this talk for Fannie Mae, And if people are optimistic about personal finances, well, okay, how do I capture some of that? Well, I can measure consumer confidence, and is this the time to buy a house? Well, I'll go out and create a survey or have a tool, a measurement tool to actually measure and validate it. And it could be in a group workshop where people who are experts in the field look at a graphical function and say, yeah, this is the way it should look. And then I'm going to I may create an index. I may have, the survey will give me an index on how, an index could be several factors, and we'll discuss what they mean later, in which it says this is right now a pulse of what the situation is. And when we do that, we're going to go from the soft construct to something that we can actually put and use in models. And okay. So I think the first thing we're going to do is we have two models, and we're going to introduce them. And I think I'm going to hand it over to David to talk about the first model.
So let's just say a little bit more. So again, like as Pascal said, for this workshop, we were kind of inspired by certain comments, like for instance, by important people like Kim Warren, and the idea of reputation in organizational research or studies. This is and this book was one that, when we found it, was chock full of interesting kind of frameworks and ways of thinking about all kinds of variables that were important, driving kind of reputation of an organization. And we put together just a little diagram here to kind of give you more of a sense of what this book is about. Basically, organizations often face crises. Something starts to go wrong with their business model. There's some sort of a scandal maybe associated with leadership. They are involved in things that kind of threaten them in some way. And or sometimes there are organizations that are advocating or working against their business model. For instance, here we have an organization like Greenpeace might even kind of like stage an event to kind of like challenge an organization in some way. Pascal's kind of like indicated that as a reputational challenge. The organization needs to kind of be strategic in thinking about how to kind of like manage communications with the public. So a lot of this book is really kind of like written in the context of large corporations that do face all kinds of challenges business-wise and ethically. And the question is, you know, what is a way to kind of resolve those issues, and in particular, how to kind of like address them in a way that maintains or brings back their reputation. And what's so interesting is that I think it's very relevant for, even though this book was written about 10 years ago, 2011, by Daniel Diermeier at the Kellogg School of Management. One thing that comes out is the role of the media, and how crises are things that the media likes to kind of pick up, negative stories in particular, and how negative stories actually really drive a process that may be, you know, largely warranted, or in some cases maybe unwarranted, that corporations have to kind of, or organizations have to kind of like mount. But we can think about, of course, all kinds of organizations that face reputational crises, from, you know, a local or a presidential administration to any kind of like organization. These are some examples that are featured in the book. For instance, Exxon and BP and oil spills and how they've kind of responded. There's the Bayer's purchase, the German pharmaceutical purchasing Monsanto, and the controversy about inheriting something that was kind of a cancer-causing or potentially cancer-causing product for lawn care. Things like that are all kind of like featured in the book. And they talk about this idea of a trust radar. And the trust radar is actually, it has two axes, and they talk about, these are meaningful concepts to people like me, a psychologist, but empathy, transparency, expertise, and commitment. They basically say that there are some more favorable or advantageous ways of responding to crises, just from a public relations perspective, that corporations need to be aware of. And they talk about the need to kind of really be proactive about having resources and people to respond to those things. Pascal, did you want to say anything about the trust, anything else about the trust radar? Or
No, I think we should continue.
Okay. So this, and actually Pascal.
I'm going to stop sharing, so you can stop.
Yeah, and I'm going to start sharing because as Pascal said, we've built two models. One of them is the reputation crisis model. So this was like inspired by, both models were inspired by the book. But this one really gets at some of the dynamics that I was just trying to describe. And what we have done and what we know is actually really good practice with any system dynamics modeling project is to elicit variables and then start to think about identifying feedback structures that represent the problem that you're looking to kind of simulate, being mindful of who you're building that model for. There's one loop, a reinforcing loop here, and we are assuming that people have some familiarity with these techniques of building causal loop diagrams. But we have one loop here that is a reinforcing loop that we've labeled or themed the outraged public. And basically it picks up on this idea that if something happens to an organization that attracts media attention, that media attention is likely to drive development of negative stories. And those negative stories potentially can create a certain level of quote unquote moral outrage in the community, in the public. And that moral outrage further kind of like inspires people to tune in and listen and watch. And of course that feeds this dynamic of journalism, of bringing people back day after day for a news show or watching a newspaper, that kind of thing. There's another loop over here where that starts to kind of like recognize that there would be, of course, some sort of an organizational response. There's a delay, maybe, to kind of like noticing that the media is starting to kind of like do journalism on a particular entity about a particular issue. And then the question is like, what is the response? So there's both an effective combination of what the trust radar can kind of be distilled into. It gets a little bit complicated with these soft ideas, but a combination of comps and warmth that will serve to kind of impact the number of negative stories that are being produced. There's also the possibility that the organizational response is not effective, and then there's an ineffective combination of warmth and response, as they've kind of described in the book. But that, in turn, can drive positive stories that will hopefully decrease moral outrage over time, and things will kind of like settle down over a period of time if there's an effective response. But these are the three loops that are really kind of like driving.
David, I think we got that mixed up here. Effective really should be ineffective, and ineffective should be effective.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, let's change it now.
Yeah, sorry. I'm looking at this, you look at this over and over again, and then you say, oh, that's not right, when you actually hear it said. See, I'm just showing that this is a work in progress, because
right.
Ineffective combination give you negative stories, which promotes outrage. And,
that's right.
So that the first one is ineffective, right? The ineffective combination give you negative. So the orange is ineffective. That's right, ineffective.
There's there's a balance. So basically,
that's effective. But the green is effective, and the other one is ineffective. That's effective.
Right. It didn't let me save it.
Yeah, if you change it to, because it's another variable's got the same name, so you have to change one of them to a complete third thing.
We're learning something new. So call it. Yeah, that's good.
Every time I model this problem comes up.
Yeah, it's a good thing to learn when you're giving a presentation too. These little things. Ineffective.
Okay. Very
So
good.
there, effective communications, positive stories, green. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the idea. The idea, though, is that what's very interesting is that you can really think it plays out in other studies that I've looked at too. Like both positive and negative emotions are they have kind of different roles. You could think one is kind of like the complement or the inverse of the other, but I have seen in many studies and in many kind of models that there's a need to kind of like separate both the negative from the positive. In this case, generating negative stories versus positive stories. And this idea of earned media coming from negative stories or themes is something that is quite prevalent in the literature.
So ineffective combination, Thomas the Tank, the company that makes Thomas the Tank, had zero warmth, zero confidence, and they almost went bankrupt. The Mercedes initially had positive competence or expertise, and they didn't realize that they needed more warmth. So they weren't doing very well until they actually brought warmth into their messages. So there are stories out there to relate to some of these concepts.
We're going to say more about this somewhat complicated translation of things from the trust radar into these two constructs. But basically, as Pascal was saying, the literature, this particular document, this particular book, basically says that warmth and competence are kind of effective. A combination of those is more effective than others. So we'll say more about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to place this in the context.
Say something about your color scheme: the green, the blue, the red.
Oh, that's just me. The green was goodness and the red was badness. But actually, I don't have a consistent color scheme yet. The color scheme in the one that David was discussing. Okay, the color scheme is not optimal. Let's see. Let me get to him. This was meant to say that the green was good things, and the red was bad things. That's it. That was the only thing that the color scheme here meant.
Okay, thank you.
So
From South
I guess if we publish this in a journal that used color, then we would be more careful. This one, okay. So now I'd like to talk about another model. Let me say one thing. We're going to, in this first 90 minutes, we're going to not demonstrate that each of these models has a stock and flow structure. We're going to go through the process of saying how we applied techniques and methods to create these models, and in general, how you would do them with your own models. And we decided to give an overview of the models here with a causal loop diagram. And then once we jump to this afternoon, once we've gone through the whole process, then we will go and each of us demonstrate the actual stock and flow versions of the models. Those models are up in the website, and also any changes we make today, I'll just make those changes in the website. So you'll have, at the end of the day, or at least in a day or two, you'll have more, the actual updated versions of things. So this model, which I'll go to right now. Let me stop. Let me go to that one. This one. So I'm thinking of creating models as writing stories. And I looked at the different papers and articles about reputation, and I thought, well, okay, what story can I write? And then put it up on a board and say, okay, let me try to implement this as a causal loop diagram. And the story is this. A company wants to hire and keep creative people. They're a new company. They want to hire, they want to recruit talent, and especially creative talent, to build new products, maybe Apple or actually a small company, maybe Zoom. Some company wants to build creative products, and the more the creative people they can bring in, but there's a competition for creative people. They don't all want to come to a company. They want to come to some company that really is great. So the reputation of the company is important in doing that. And when they have great people, they can build these competitive offerings. However, in this particular problem, there was some issues with quality. And it's a small company, so some of those creative people had to move over and do tasks they didn't want to do. debug things. You know, they really want to do design, you know, play around with stuff. They had to debug. They had to deal with customers. They had to do all these things to address quality issues that were in the product. They were unhappy. And because they were unhappy, some of them, their loyalty to the company started waning and they started leaving. Okay. So, so this is basically the model that we created to show these effects. Okay.
And reputation is right there. So
reputation, in this case, in the last model, reputation was the end result. In this case, we're looking at losing and gaining customers. If the quality concerns are high enough, people are going to leave. If the competitive offerings are not strong enough, people aren't going to come to your company. So that's the idea. Very simple ideas. Each of these two models, we can add more things. Like to the model David described, we can add the effect of social media, which is in the book. So we can also add, but we decided what's the simplest thing we can do. Let's put it together, see if it works, and talk about it. So that's the.
Any comments about these two causal loop diagrams or the idea of a model of reputation dynamics, and then in this case, looking at employee loyalty and the quality of people in the organization. And thanks for like pointing out that challenge in the first loop. That was good. The model works well, but you always need to kind of like review, and we've been working on.
So it's sometimes hard to play with some of these things. People get serious about their PhD theses, or even as in universities, they worry about what they need to do, or in the consulting world. But it'd be great just to create your own story from some topic. Look at some books, articles, and then create something. It doesn't have to be complicated. Use materials from this workshop. Start with a CLD, translate into stock and flow, then going back between the CLD and stock and flow until they make sense, and iterate. And then tell us what you discover. So that's a challenge to you. We wish we could do that during the workshop, but I think we need more time to do that. So, David.
Yeah. So what, I'm just putting something in the chat box. Okay. So this figure basically lays out the general model or ideas that we want to kind of like communicate, framework for really kind of like thinking about how to effectively integrate, reliably and validly integrate psychological and sociological variables into your model. And what you see here is basically attention to starting with the idea of what is the model purpose and who are we building the model for. That's something that it's kind of a refrain that I always have with me when I'm working on a project, especially when I'm starting to engage with people about a particular modeling project, really thinking carefully about, you know, what are we really focusing on? What's the problem at hand? What's the scope of that problem that we're interested in? And who's the audience? Because that has a lot to do with how much time and effort you might put into thinking about ways of putting variables into your model. And what we want to talk about is a general process that maybe some of you have already been doing informally, or maybe in a very rigorous way of transforming the construct into a variable, thinking about when and how to kind of like operationalize or define it in a particular way, how to quantify it. Suzanne's already kind of like talked a little bit about that, you know, in her comment, and then a process for assessing that overall, the utility of that work of operationalizing, quantifying, and then validating the variable, but then also kind of like thinking about how to integrate it into the overall model so that it relates effectively, so that we are both kind of like building formulas or equations that have appropriate dimensions, the same dimensions on each side, but also kind of like really lend themselves to utility, that looking at the variables as you run simulation out and look at the performance of the model, being able to kind of compare and contrast the dynamics of different variables that you're building in your model in a way that's useful. Pascal, okay, so let's spend a little bit more time just kind of like talking, go back to that, those notes.
Here?
Just the one you had up a moment ago. Yeah, so model purpose. Basically model purpose and the target audience. Really thinking carefully about who those are. Okay, go to the next. And these actually are, so this basically, I think that the phrases that we have up here are all different ways of kind of like calling attention to model purpose. Maybe, you know, overall we talk about building models to gain insight, especially in system dynamics. Sometimes we are really kind of like concerned about calibrating to, you know, a very particular kind of like circumstance, or even predicting in the relatively short term certain kinds of outcomes. Maybe models are about facilitating decision making or clarifying thinking. I think about the work, I'm working on a major project with the HIV community. So it's stakeholders who are doctors and nurses, persons who are advocates and peers working in the community, families affected by HIV. And the idea is to kind of like build a model that at the community level informs ways of facilitating HIV prevention with a big feedback loop where, you know, bringing people into more effective care sooner if they are HIV and keeping them there and helping them be virally suppressed actually is the feedback that kind of reduces incidence in the community. Or I think about the work I'm doing with my colleague Lindsay Zimmerman out at the Veterans Administration in Palo Alto, where we're working with frontline mental health workers to build a program that is really teaching them systems thinking skills and techniques for actually, they do team-based work. So these mental health providers might be a psychologist, a social worker, a psychiatrist, and maybe an art therapist working together to kind of like deliver certain kinds of programs, maybe cognitive behavioral therapy in particular, or even treatment for PTSD. How can they kind of learn ways of really understanding who their patients are and ways of better managing the evidence-based care that they are giving them? And are there certain bottlenecks in terms of wait times for services, or keeping people maybe in a particular program like cognitive behavioral therapy for an extended period of time, even though that patient may not be really gaining anymore? So thinking carefully about the purpose of the model there is really important, and it informs how specific you might want to be or need to be in terms of operationalizing and integrating models and variables in your model. Okay, Pascal.
So I'm working on a model of the Maya collapse with John Hayward, Eric Apama, Dana Poljavi, and basically we try to gain understanding of historical reasoning behind it. We're looking at monuments, when monuments were created, Maya monuments were created, Maya monuments were not created at the time, and we're trying to predict the warfare behavior of that. So we're trying to gain understanding, and the target audience is people who want to look at history quantitatively in our community. So, okay,
so
let's move on.
Different things are going to matter to different stakeholder groups that you're working with on these modeling projects, and of course that's going to inform how, you know, detailed or fine-grained or, you know, general you might be about how you go about this process of putting these types of constructs into your model. Yeah, and so the reputation models in this workshop, just for example, you know, the audience is all of you, System Dynamics Society conference participants, and the purpose is to create models to illustrate these processes. So these are demonstration models, and you know, there is not a lot of like rigorous empirical work, you know, that has been used to inform how we parameterize the model. But of course, that's something that could happen if there were a group of people that wanted to kind of build the model for that purpose. And then, but so yeah, contrast that with a model for a for-profit company that would be very, very concerned about strategic planning, and maybe their purpose is to really be much more confident about how the model would inform certain ways of managing reputational challenges, and there maybe your audience is exclusively like company executives. That's not work that I do as a community psychologist working at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, but there are many people in the society that are doing that kind of like work and maybe largely working with that kind of a stakeholder group. I'd be curious to know what kinds of stakeholder groups all of you are working with, and you can put that in the chat. Okay, Pascal.
Our most important slide.
Okay, yeah, so I think here we're talking about, so for each construct that you're considering, we've kind of put this flow map together, this flow diagram together. You basically can say, okay, if you have a variable such as reputation that you want to put in your model, you can ask the question, is this variable valid enough for the model purpose in the audience? So, just reflecting on our purpose today for teaching, we think that what we have come up with in terms of thinking about reputation is rigorous enough. So, we could move towards a process of relating that to other variables and really kind of like stepping back and kind of validating the overall model. But if you're in a situation where you think that there needs to be more of a drill down on what this variable is and how to like work with it, then you have to further assess and define the construct. And one important question to ask is like, is this variable a function of measurable variables that you might know about? And we'll give some examples of this in a minute. If it is, then you can start to work to really kind of represent it in your model and validate the performance of that variable in your model, kind of like jumping right to like what Suzanne was saying, like, oh, let's just put this on a scale from 0 to 10, and let's think about what a higher or lower performance in this variable would mean over time relative to the problem that we're interested in. If it's not a function of measurable variables, then there's the process of operationalizing and or quantifying it. Sometimes we don't have empirical data on something, but we can still come up with useful scales for representing it. If we do have information that's already available, we could do analysis, descriptive or inferential statistics to kind of like look at the characteristics of that variable in maybe the context of a particular project, and they're kind of like thinking about then what scale of measurement that variable is assessed on is important, and we're going to say more about that in a moment.
So basically, if we can measure it, and we don't need to go through that transform. If we can't really measure it yet, we want to investigate its measurement possibilities, then, because we're going to put it in the model, it has to have some measurement. We've got to go through this process of operationalizing, quantifying it, and we're going to be looking in the research, we're going to be looking everywhere, and maybe surveys, whatever. We need to make sure that's something that's valid, if we care about it.
Yes,
enough.
there is a problem in terms of what the output is going to look like, depending on the type of scale that you have. If you have a true zero concept, then a ratio scale makes a lot of sense, and that's what most physical scales are about. They're ratios. On the other hand, psychologists rarely work with the technology of getting a ratio scale. What they do at best would be an interval scale, but most of the time it's essentially an ordinal scale. And if you actually looked at the data when it's measured with let's say an interval scale, that output would look different than what would be with a ratio scale. So
Ralph, we're going to cover that in a little while. We're going to define those terms. We're going to cover exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
And Suzanne had a question too, but Ralph, thank you for that comment.
So my question is, and maybe I'm ahead of the game here, but let's say you don't have any historic data, but you're getting your small group, your team, your family, whoever the participants are that are building this to create insight, to say, okay, we're going to use this structure and we're going to collect data, soft data from here forward and put it into the model to validate it. Is that feasible?
So actually the first step is defining it, defining the variable, and then there are steps for actually different types of things you can do to actually validate it in terms of its face value, its content value, its construct value, and there's a bunch of more of those. So the different pieces, and we're trying to break things up into smaller pieces to think through each. So each you have a set of questions and thoughts about each one. So yes, you would get your group. So you may need to, some variables you may not, you might be left undefined in your model, just in there internally. Other ones you probably need to relate to the world to make sure you're grounded in the model. And then yes, you gather people. And
what I'm really getting at too is you may be in a situation such as I am often, where you can look at the literature, or you may even have primary data from a study that you've carried out, where you have produced correlation coefficients, looking at kind of like some patterns of association among variables, or you may have a multiple regression analysis, or even those kinds of like things where you have been able to maybe look at the strength of an association in among two variables, a bivariate relationship, or maybe some sort of cluster analysis, or maybe there is a trial where there's an effect size that's been produced that shows that one treatment is beneficial over another at a certain endpoint. In epidemiology, we talk about relative risks and odds ratios, and we put confidence intervals and things like that about those. And so all of that information may be very important and useful, given the purpose and the audience that you're kind of like working with, to bring to the table. And then it's this kind of like iterative process of thinking about, as Pascal said, how to define it, and then what would be a useful quantification of it. Sometimes we have measures. I think we have an example later on of like the Bec Depression Scale. I don't know if you saw that. Like it goes from like 0 to 63 or something like that.
We're getting to it. We're getting to it. Yeah, 0 to 63.
Okay, thank you.
Keep asking questions, by the way. I mean.
Yeah, I'm watching the chat.
When I listen to David, I get more educated. Okay. Okay, so next, moving on. So.
Yeah.
A diagram like this, by the way, is what's coming next. It's just what we're going to talk about or might not talk about, but it's what's in the mind map that is there, so you can actually.
Yeah, and let's spend a minute, because this is something that Pascal and I were kind of like talking about a bit before. So an activity is to kind of assess and define the construct. So that's exactly what we've just been talking about. And we thought it was useful to think about comparing or contrasting kind of an index versus a proxy. So what is an index? What is a proxy? An index is really something that might have empirical information available. And Pascal had this example of a fear index. I don't know where you found that, but
we're going to go into that now. Let's do that.
And let's take a look at that. So yeah, Pascal, you want to say something about this?
This is the VIX, which is, if you look currently, I have the recent one up here. It's about options trading, and it measures the degree of confidence in the market. And this was July 9th. It went up in February because of the pandemic, and market actually correlated with some of this and went up again later, and I'm not sure what it is today. So this is an index one index, and then I'll go to the next one because David, you can. Okay.
And so. Right. And so something like that could be used in a variety of ways. it could actually be kind of imposed on, a model as kind of an exogenous factor.
Yes, yes.
Or maybe you use it as a reference mode for really thinking about, okay, what is driving these ebbs and flows, and starting to think about, a way of maybe using the fear index to represent a certain concept or construct in your model relative to others. Go ahead, Pascal.
The effect of pandemics on companies. This might be a variable in your model to actually match. So David, the next one is reputation.
Well, one thing that I noticed about the time graph is the fact that there are many, many points in time.
Yeah.
In psychology, you're lucky if you get before and after, maybe a third time. That certainly is something that you have to deal with things like reputation. It may very well be that you only have it before and after, and perhaps a follow-up study.
Right. So later on we'll talk about an index we used, which is a ratio of negative stories to the total number of stories as an index of moral outrage, which is related to reputation.
But I think But I think Ralph's making a slightly different but important point that, Ralph's right. Like in most of if for those of us who are social and behavioral researchers, we're lucky if we often do kind of like cross-sectional work. Maybe we have baseline and follow-up at like 6 or 12 months. Most NIH grants are only for 5 years. So, we often have very limited opportunity to even kind of like do some sort of repeated measures type of analysis. And that brings up the utility of thinking qualitatively in mixed methods, because I think many of us have done this, especially early on in a model building process where we're eliciting variables. We might also say, okay, can you give us a reference mode of that? Just draw on a quick behavior over time graph what you think that trend looks like over some relevant period of time. And that information, of course, is something that you can use to help define, the utility of that variable and start to think about more technical things about how to represent it and scale it in your model. Thanks for that point, Ralph.
So David, this is about a scale for the reputation construct from a company.
Yeah, this is an image of, you can see how kind of contextually rich one might want to be or get, and I'm not putting any credence on what's up here, but it's just to kind of show that in some ways, so psychologists often talk about building and validating, measurement models, and here what we have is kind of a representation of a number of dimensions that support a number of dimensions that are all factors or constructs in and of themselves, things like leadership, performance, product, services, and innovation, and then they are related to other constructs such as feeling, esteem, admiration, and trust, and you can start to think about how some of these ideas may be important and are dynamically related. And Pascal, did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, this group, this is a simple version of a reputation tracking index that this group created to help companies get a pulse on what people think of their reputation. So they'll do surveys. And so this type of data can be used in your model. You could actually use to measure reputation. You could go out and see what the actual value something like this has, and then correlate it with your model. So that's.
And I guess this is also an example of something that turned into an instrument to collect data that was collected on an interval scale.
An interval scale. And we'll talk about the scaling. David will talk about the scale. Oh, I will. David will talk about the scaling.
More, yeah.
So now there's a proxy. So back the proxy.
So the idea of the index was, something that was kind of empirically supported, some sort of agreed upon way of representing an idea, maybe over time like that. But then a proxy is something that can kind of be used to, you can actually, so you compute a proxy. A proxy is really just a calculation or a computation that represents an idea. And here, what we're looking at is, so for instance, actual outrage, that red variable, that auxiliary variable, it can be thought of as a proxy, and it's being computed. It's the outrage maximum times basically the proportion of negative stories over negative and positive stories. And there's and that's something that that's a way of kind of transforming this variable actual outrage into something useful for the model. In this case, actual outrage is being compared to outrage, this gap in perceived outrage, and that's what's driving our kind of like main psychological construct, is perceived moral outrage. This is a model that we'll look at this in the afternoon in the actual model.
And we have hard variables people could measure in some sense.
So notice, Pascal's, there's like this, look at the denominator of that one part of the formula. We're adding 0.0001. Yeah. That's because in this case, you can't divide through by 0. So we're kind of avoiding that problem there. And I don't know if anybody has comments about that kind of a dilemma, but it is something to, of course, be mindful of. And if you're not mindful of it, and you are using a technique like this to create a proxy variable, you could see your model stop working because of that. So
yeah, it would definitely stop working. I think that it doesn't really change the model much by doing that. It just prevents you from dividing by 0.
Go ahead, Pascal.
Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. These are hard variables that you can conceivably measure, and we're taking a soft variable and relating it to a hard variable, which say sort of approximates it. Unless we get something better, this actually approximates it. So, and when Ralph discussed that, Ralph mentioned that earlier. This is an example to support what he was saying.
And by the way, in this case, you can see we have scaled this variable from 0 to 100 units of moral outrage. So you can be very creative in how you kind of like name units. You just need to be consistent, of course.
And we're gonna demonstrate this in the model this afternoon.
Yeah, and the issue of like working with 0, and if you have multiplicative versus additive effects, we're going to get to that. So I appreciate that comment. Go ahead, Pascal.
So scalable pressure also is in the model. By the way, some of the models are showing here when you go to the website, which has the models. If you look at our 2017 piece, it has the we have previous workshops, we have all the slides, we have the models in both Vensim and Stella. So any model we have here is in there. You can actually run them if you want to. So
as examples.
As examples. Yeah. As examples. So this model is there too. Okay.
So
let's move on.
This is an example of a proxy. Okay.
Yeah, it's a proxy. So now I'm going to talk. No, you're still talking. Oh, it's me. Okay, so we're going to, in the case, we made a decision. Is it a function of measure of variables? And we'll say no. We got to transform it. Okay, it's not a proxy. So we go to a step in which we talk about operationalizing it, relating it to a scale, and also quantifying it in some way.
Keeping in mind that like in system dynamics models, we generally are always putting everything on a ratio scale, right? Because of the math that's involved. But anyway, okay, so
I'm going to go through this quickly unless you have questions. But basically, when Ralph talked earlier, he talked about nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio scales, and we thought it would be a good idea to just let people who are not aware of it, and I wasn't when I first started this, to give an example of it and talk about what it means. So the term operationalize, which none of my software likes to think of as an actual word, is actually a process. Operationalization is a process that describes how a concept will be measured. I wish they had a better word, but that's the word. So there are different measurement scales. Nominal scale is just, there's no ordering. It's either day or night. It's hot or cold. There's no ordering involved, time or temperature. The ordinal scale, well, now I've got some sort of ordering, evening, afternoon, noon, direction of, I can look at it more of a direction than before, or cold, cool, hot, warm. So we have the properties of the previous scale plus some additional ones. Now here we actually have numbers. We can associate numbers with them. And the difference between, if I look at Celsius, the difference between Celsius degrees makes sense. Between 100 and 90 is the same as between 80 and 70. That difference makes sense in a interval scale.
Right, and interval scales, of course, are, as Ralph also pointed out, like in psychological and social research, like we often are measuring things. If we're doing quantitative research, we come up with instruments that ask multiple questions that tap into a construct like depression, for instance, and we might ask on a scale from 1 to 5, how blue are you feeling, or something like that, and we'll get into that. But an interval scale basically has equal distance in between each of the points, but there's no absolute zero.
Yeah, and this is important because we want that feature in our models, at least.
We take all kinds of liberties also.
Yes, we do. We take liberty. I should say that. It's good to know what liberties we're taking, but we do take liberties to define. Yeah.
Interval scales as ratio scales.
But we really, we try to convert things to a ratio scale if possible, which is now we have Kelvin. Kelvin is absolute zero scale. So now
reflecting Pascal as a physicist.
Yeah, you can tell. So the absolute zero is there is a meaningful origin, and all ratios are now make sense. I don't have to take ratio. I can take because now I have a meaningful origin. It's not just differences that between things that make sense, but ratios of temperature make sense.
But for instance, in like in health research, public health research, and things, you can think about somebody's weight. Of course, age, things like that. These are true, ratio scale variables.
Yeah, and it makes a difference in terms of the output, what you would expect if the data were, let's say, interval versus a scale that worked with ratios.
Yeah.
S.S. Stevens was the one who developed the ratio type scale in psychology. And so he was interested in looking at essentially the correlation between measurements on a particular situation, which would be interval, and then getting identical measures, but this time ratio from the same individuals, and take a look at the formula or equation that linked the two. He came up with that.
Okay, so let's keep going.
And one other point,
yeah.
You can, so things like anxiety, depression, enthusiasm could all be kind of put on a scale that includes zero. And again, it gets back to like Susan's early point, like, is this a meaningful scale, something that people can appreciate in the model?
So we're assuming when we put stuff in models that they're ratio.
Right.
Because that's what differential equations require, ratio scales. So we should be aware of that assumption. Here's an example. Marriage. Nominal. Question. Are you satisfied with your marriage? Yes or no? That's a nominal scale. How satisfied? Hot, warm, lukewarm, cold. Okay, that's ordinal. Interval. How satisfied are you with your marriage again? And you can give a number to it. Like surveys, we see different numbers like this. I never see very, very satisfied. I always see very satisfied. No, 3 varies. Okay. What is the quality of couples interaction? This is a ratio scale. And this is where Gottman, who's a psychologist, looked at they observed negative interactions over a period of time with customers, with married couples. And he can actually tell if someone's going to divorce or not by looking at 5 minutes of conversation with them, which is very interesting, which should be interesting to model. So there are ratio scales with regard to marriage existing in the world.
So the question is like, if you have a relevant variable for your model, what's out there and how has it been presented? if there's more research on this and it's been used in different studies and reported using those different kinds of scales, that can often be really important information to cite to support key assumptions in your model.
I want to tell you, by the way, the green flag means David, this flag means me. So I'm always looking to see what the flag is. So David's up next on quantify. I did the part of transform, which was operationalize, and David gets to do quantify. And we're on time, I think.
Yeah. So in terms of quantification, so two concepts here. Some sort of guidance for how to do that is what we want to relate now. And then also, and this is something that you guys have also brought up, the importance of and the utility of maintaining certain range limits in the variables, both for managing the overall performance of the model, but also for interpretation. We have examples of this coming up. Reputational, I think we can just go to the next
We just go to the next slide, yeah. This is the Bec scale you mentioned earlier.
So I was giving the example earlier that like the Bec Depression Scale. So this is a relatively, it's still a relatively widely used scale to measure depression. The people who have developed this have basically developed a scale that goes from 0 to 63, which feels a little bit arbitrary, but for those people who are really using this and maybe in the context of a particular psychological therapy, these different categories across the range are very meaningful to them. So anything under 10, there's no or minimal depression. 10 to 18, mild to moderate depression. 19 to 29, moderate to severe. And over 30, anything over 30 is severe depression. So you may be doing a study that would want to kind of, that might even have, you might be working with an audience that basically is, put into place therapies that are regularly using the Bec Depression Scale to kind of, look at baseline and maybe change for a certain patient population that they're working with. And so it might be really important to kind of build a model that is fine-tuned around this range. And you may also want to kind of actually take that data and look at how it could kind of inform change over time with a certain desired outcome for most patients within a certain period of time. Basically, you do need to kind of like think about what's the data and then what would be the appropriate calibration. And the calibration could be to have a variable that goes from 0 to 63 in your model, or maybe you're relating it to other things in a scale that might be a little bit different, but in a sense standard for the model, going from 0 to 100 units of depression would be, or units of this index or scale would be important. I wanted to point out that there are open source resources like this GEM database that if you are kind of like looking for instruments that might support some sort of empirical work in a modeling project, it's a good place to go to kind of find psychological, social, behavioral kinds of instruments that that might be useful, and that's available on the web.
So set up this little link over here that we have here and here that you could just click on that link and it'll open up another website.
It goes to that, and then there are many different constructs. You see all those content areas. It's health related, but then you can look at, you see the tab up there for constructs too, and it will give you, it'll let you search by construct or search by area of focus, and then it's kind of a repository. People have published on these things, and they're basically disseminating often their instruments as well as their papers.
So Anger, I mean, all this is cool stuff. You can maybe inform some of your models by looking at some of these indexes.
That's right. Okay, Pascal. Fractions. Okay, so try to use them because they are meaningful, percentages, probabilities, right? Like, you know, they putting something on a scale that goes from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100 has certain utility. What else do we have here, Pascal?
An example.
Okay, so here's an example. We're looking at
ratio.
Yes. And so here we're using in Stella and also Vensim, there's a lookup table that could be used to kind of graphically depict a relationship, and you can build in some nonlinearity to something that might, you know, in a report be kind of like just a correlation coefficient. But here we see on the x-axis of that lookup table reputation divided by max reputation, and that's going from 0 to 1. So that's computing a fraction, and then the output on the y-axis is the effect of reputation on winning customers, and here we've set that to go from 1 to 1.5. So we're probably thinking about when we multiply something by 1, we just get whatever it is, and we're saying that maybe we'd have an effect that could kind of like show at any particular time in our model run an effect that was up to 50% greater, depending on where you are. But as that fraction of reputation goes up over time, we're seeing a greater effect. And that is being used in this stock and flow, which is part of the demonstration model that we're sharing today.
And we can actually, when you go out to the world, you can actually create this graphic and the strength of it to illustrate the effect of reputation on winning customers. There may be some data out there about that, and you can put it right here, that effect. You can put your data in here as a graphic and the strength of the graphic, depending on what the reputation measurement is.
Pascal, David, 15-minute warning for the...
Yep. Thank you. We're on schedule though for this part. It's good. Thank you, Braveheart.
Okay, yeah, Pascal, you want to talk about this? This is interesting because it really starts to talk about
scales,
scales and the utility of having a scale that might go from something like -1 to 1, 0 to 100, or 0 to 1, or above, you know, 1, 0 to 2 or 10 or something like that.
And they're all valid. They're all
anything. Yeah. If you're multiplying something by something between 0 and 1, you're decreasing the effect. Anything above 1, of course, is enhancing the effect. And for those of us doing work in, for instance, public health or epidemiology, again, maybe you do have an effect size or an odds ratio, and you know, we often see that kind of information reported in the literature, and it could be very important for reporting things. But this idea of having a negative reputation is something that probably requires more thought, and it kind of even relates to, should you or do you want to represent that as a stock? Like traditionally, stocks don't go below 0, they accumulate things. But Pascal, do you?
Yeah, so what I'm going to say is that you don't need, you may have it in a survey, negative and positive, but you can translate that into a 0 to 100 if you wanted to. That's just a translation, mathematical translation. If you do have a variable that goes from -to 1 or something like that, you can't represent it as a stock. It's only an auxiliary. So it has to be, when you start implementing these things.
Or you can, for example, in Stella, you can tell it to go negative.
You can do that, but then that's a problem because it gives you, it's an error problem. In my mind, you see it go negative, you say, uh-oh, I did the wrong thing. My stock went below 0. Yeah, it can go negative. It'll tell you to go negative.
Pascal, I think you're thinking of physical variables that have constraints and so forth.
Well, if my reputation went 0 in Stella, I would put a draining process in so that it tells me, yes, I want to find out why it went negative.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then okay. So yes, you can do that, but you have to be careful about that. That's just all I'm saying here. It's best to have it go from positive. If it's have stocks go from a 0 to 100, you can bet negotiated. Then when it goes below 0,
but 0 has to be idea of essentially the lowest, essentially a nothing.
yes.
That you would be perhaps changing the meaning of what 0 is here.
Yeah, I think you have to associate meaning with the variable. You have to put it on a scale, and then you have to decide what's appropriate to model. What you need in your model. Do you need a stock? And is this scale appropriate for a stock? Then I need to change it and map it from,
The other thing about a stock is it takes time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a question about whether you want it to take time or not. Some variables we have that are like schedule pressure, there was no time involved. It was just, this ratio in our model. If we wanted to decrease or increase or take time to smooth out, then because we're really smoothing the information, people don't immediately get outraged. It takes them a while to get outraged, I hope. So anyway, so these are issues to think about. What Ralph brought up, what I brought, the issues to think about.
And ultimately, it's about justifying, your decisions and how you have kind of operationalized and quantified things in your model. Again, leaning on on the purpose of the model and your audience. Okay, what's next?
So one thing though, if your variable is negative to positive, you can always translate it when you implement it. So you can always make it into a positive scale when you implement it. You just have different meaning for the variables. You have to associate meaning for the values. That's mathematically you can. So next, okay.
Oh, okay. So I think all right. Here we're basically saying that there are lots of ways of doing these. Some of these are a bit more complex, and sometimes it may demand more complex. But you can use an algebraic function. You can use the graphical function. We just saw a little bit of an example of both of those. You can use combinations of those two in your model, and the model itself may also kind of like constrain the range. And we have examples of looking at using smooths and using a coflow structure that kind of like takes care of that problem of constraining a range for you in your model. We recommend against using if-then-else statements to kind of manage ranges. That's not good modeling practice. And I don't know if anybody else has something to say about that. And then, yeah, there's also kind of like just building a model where you know that its calibration kind of keeps things within a certain range. And there could be utility to that, for certain kinds of work, but not best practice. And I think we have more examples of each of these, don't we, Pascal?
Yep. Algebraic function.
So
yeah, we can go through these fast, but each one of these is just these examples are in the website. This is just doing it by an algebraic function.
Right.
And we use this a lot in the reputation model, where we're looking at making this the available anger, maximum anger minus anger, except I don't necessarily divide by anger. And then what's left. So once this goes to 0, this stops flowing in. Once the anger reaches the maximum, the flow stops.
And of course, you can see now we're jumping ahead to we've kind of moved beyond understanding why anger is important and how we've defined it,
yes,
for the thing, and we're now moving towards this idea of putting it into the model and scaling it.
In mechanics, and this is, the only thing is that if you look at the next one, which is, this is the same model, same example, except now I've got available reputation. I have in here.
Same structure.
Here's the same structure.
Formulation.
Here's the equations. And this is an on-off switch. I have one on-off switch in the model so we can turn off, so we can see how the model works. So the same structure, that same structure right up there. Okay, let's move on.
We're going to show you that in the afternoon.
Yeah. And then you could have a graphical function do it. So rather than have the difference, we can have some sort of graphical function that slows this down once it gets up to near its maximum limit. So these are mechanical. I don't think we need to spend too much time on these. Then there's a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the important things is that if you're modeling a phenomena, it may be some combination of this that actually makes your data look like your model. So that's why it's useful to have these different ways of doing it, so you can match your data.
I think, and I would say that I think that there is utility to, depending again on like what you're trying to model, you know, to the extent you can be consistent in managing certain ways of handling scales of your psychological or social variables or constructs in your model, there can be benefits to that in terms of explaining the model to people and you know, building confidence in how things are being formulated, and of course, you know, keeping things on the same scales makes it, you know, makes these ideas more easily comparable or interpretable.
So what we want to do now, so we've gone through most, I guess the most of the material for the morning that we wanted to cover. We're gonna, in the afternoon, we're going to talk about validating variables, which I think requires more attention, and relating variables to other variables, and do some demos. But we wanted to say, does anyone just break out with questions if you have anything we've covered so far? Any questions or thoughts or corrections or insights that you might have gotten just by listening to what we're saying?
So Christina had a point. Normalizing takes care of negative regional, but I'm not sure how intuitive it is. Yeah. So what, like, you mean kind of taking a variable and putting it so that it has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, that kind of like, is that what you're thinking about, Christina? That's actually something that is, if you have data from a study and you wanted to kind of create standard scores, that's a nice thing to do because it makes them comparable, and then there could be analysis that suggests you know, ways of using that information when you move into actually placing those.
So how does that relate? How does it relate to one of these things? So what was that?
Oh, somebody had a question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Just jump in with your questions. We, you know, this, you know.
Go ahead.
Yeah. You can ask your questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah. So this is very interesting, and so sometimes we're measuring things that don't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like so if you have a stock and it has a sort of a functionality, and then somewhere along the way it loses its functionality, often very long before it reaches depletion. Like a married can, of course, you know, be depleted, but they're still married.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's
So,
interesting.
so
Yeah.
there might be in some sort of equilibrium or some sort of stasis, homostasis there at one point.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So that's valid. You know, that if you evaluated marriages and you found that happens in many marriages, that there's no excitement or no interest in the other person, that's a measurable thing. You can measure that and do with surveys, and then you can make that part of your model. When do people do this? Maybe they do it here. Maybe they do it early, you know, in the middle of their marriage. Like I've been married almost 40 years.
So, and along those lines, I'm thinking that, so you may have a variable that represents marital quality, and maybe that is a stock.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, like maybe it, the quality goes very low, maybe even it's at 0 and it's staying at that level for some period of time. And then, so I think the question what your question is making me think about is how would that variable be used in the model, and maybe you wanted to kind of look at dynamics of people being activated to kind of maybe change that, maybe, and we're going to talk about this, and it kind of relates to like how to kind of combine variables.
Yeah.
Are you looking at an additive or a multiplicative relationship with other things downstream?
That'd be an interesting concept. How do you, I mean, I think to myself, okay, let's go study this. What causes that? What are some of the factors? Like do a little hexagon diagram. What causes this to happen? What are the factors involved? I write about it. Then I go to experts. What do you think causes this? Or is there anything else I missed? And you build up this diagram of causes and effects and stuff until you can put that into a model. which
Pascal,
is,
I'm thinking about some of the examples we have on threshold effects too.
yeah.
Because you could be kind of in a steady state for a period of time with something, and then maybe there's some other kind of factor that is slowly increasing things, and then you hit a certain threshold, and boom, now people,
Yes.
they've separated. They're no longer living together or something like that. Or divorce is kind of like, they take legal action or something like that. And we have those kinds of models.
And there are books about that. Gutman has a book. There was another woman who did a lot of talks on that. She's the mathematician, looked at marriages. So anyway.
Other comments? We have like 1 minute before we're going to take our lunch break.
Yeah, so.
But, so far, so good. Are people finding the pace of this and the way we're presenting the information to be useful or not?
Yes, very useful.
Could you repeat the author's name of the book you held up?
Yes, and that's in the, Pascal has a...
It's on the slide too. It's in the material.
Daniel Diermeier.
Diermeier. He also wrote a free paper too on the subject. So if you look up his name, there are papers that he's written about the subject. It's a very readable book. I actually listened to it also.
I'm interested in the tragedy of the commons and decision making that happens around it. Could you direct me to some work that's been done in that area?
I think that yeah, I know that archetype has been described, and maybe between now and 12:30, I might do a quick lit search.
Well, yeah, Bill, I can get back to you.
That'd be great. Thank you, Pascal.
If I see anything, I don't have anything off mine, but tragedy of the commons in regard to soft variables, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to be able to tell the story of how the tragedy of the commons evolves when a group of people participate in it.
Yeah.
There are a number of games you can play that simulate the tragedy of the commons, but my question is what's going on in the people's minds? What mental models are active? What perceptions are really steering the bus to force the tragedy of the commons to occur?
I haven't. Yeah, I don't have anything on the tip of my tongue on that, but I might have seen something. But I'll take a look. But after the conference.
Sorry, Bill, do you specifically mean within the field of SD, or do you mean sort of more broadly that you could adapt? Because obviously, like Eleanor Ostrom comes to mind, she did a lot of work in institutional economics around tragedy of the commons, and sort of community factors around fisheries, I think was her main sort of area of research.
Yes, and Ralph, what's mediated modeling by Van de Ven? Some very interesting work looking at kind of like complex community level or environmental issues may lean on or touch that archetype, tragedy of the commons.
Exactly. I
think
think about global warming and what the kinds of decisions that oil company executives have to make regarding how they transition from old energy to new energy.
Okay, so we're going to have to stop now.
We'll
So hold your questions and bring them. We can, when we first start again in half an hour, 12:30. Well, half an hour.
Braveheart, what should we do? Should we stay online or get out and come back?
No, we'll
in?
get out.
It's a different link from my understanding.
Yeah, it's a different link.
Just
So-
go
so-
and you come back.
Yes,
And I'll
so
be there.
yes, just
Thank
check
you,
the link
everyone.
in your profile. Just check the second link.
That's
And bring questions. So the first part of that session, we can just answer questions for 5 or 10 minutes about what you might have so far. So, okay.
Thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you in a half hour.